What's happening, y'all? Welcome inside the Fantasy Stock Exchange. Bush coming at you solo today to break down the ceiling and the floor of all the top 24 wide receivers in ADP. This should give you guys a good idea when you're drafting who has high ceilings, who has low floors. And if you've already had your draft, maybe some guys that you want to go out and trade. Let me know down below if in the comments if you've already had your drafts. I can grade your teams and all that kind of stuff. But in drafts, we never want to be drafting based on absolutes, right? This guy doesn't I don't want to draft this guy because he projects as my wide receiver 14 and he's going as the wide receiver 12 in ADP. A lot of people do that. I don't do that. I don't use projections. I don't draft based on that. What I do is I weight all the factors that are involved in having a high ceiling, having a low floor, and I determine a range of outcomes based on those players and determine if their cost is appropriate for the risk level that they have. So this video is basically going to outline the range of outcomes for all these wide receivers. If you guys enjoy at any point, hit the like button. It really helps us out in the YouTube algorithm. Comment any of your thoughts down below. Like I said, leave your team, leave any questions you have down below. Subscribe to the channel if you are new around here. If you're leaving comments and you're not subscribed yet, what are you doing? Hit the subscribe button. It is totally free to do so, and we really, really appreciate it. But with that being said, let's get right into it. Okay, so for each one of these guys, I basically, back in July, I weighed all the peripherals of these players that are required to reach a high ceiling. And how I defined a high ceiling was 20 plus PPR points per game, typically about a top five, top three wide receiver on average in any given season. And I did that in the video titled, Who is the next league winning wide receiver? And I'll have that link down below in the description if you want more explanation on how I weighed these factors. Basically, I'm going to go through and re-show all those peripherals when I talk about each player and talk about, their ranges of outcomes based on those things. So the first guy, and I'll try and zoom through the first couple wide receivers because it's pretty clear what their ranges of outcomes are. We have Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp definitely has the ceiling to be the wide receiver one overall in fantasy. We saw it last year. But the things that are kind of contributing to why he may not have that ceiling anymore is we have Allen Robinson coming in who could maybe limit his target share. We also have Matthew Stafford dealing with an elbow injury as a risk as well. Cooper Kupp's ceiling is still a top three wide receiver, right? It's definitely not, in my opinion, the 1,900 yards and 16 touchdowns that he had last year. Hell, I don't think NFL defensive coordinators are stupid enough to let that happen again. I think they're going to be plotting for Cooper Kupp a lot more this year, maybe than they were last year. The floor, though, is pretty high, right? Assuming Stafford isn't getting injured, I think this is still a locked and loaded top five wide receiver as the floor. So the range of outcomes for Kupp is wide receiver one overall, probably wide receiver five overall in points per game if he doesn't hit his ceiling as long as Stafford is able to stay healthy, but that does present some risk for him. Justin Jefferson obviously has a very high ceiling as well. The pass offense is expected to get a boost in Minnesota with Kevin O'Connell coming in from the Rams, which is, a higher up-tempo system than they were running in Minnesota. Typically, they were a very run-heavy offense before. I think we're going to see them shift towards more of a pass-heavy approach. Justin Jefferson scored 20-plus PPR points per game down the stretch last year once he was, more integrated into the offense. The offensive coordinator said, we're not throwing Jefferson the ball enough. And then after that point, he was just one of the best receivers in fantasy. The ceiling for Justin Jefferson is wide receiver one overall. And I also think the ceiling for him is similar to what we saw from Kupp last year, where you're getting bar none the wide receiver one overall in Justin Jefferson. I think that's what his ceiling is. His floor, again, is probably top five, excluding injury to him or his quarterback. I don't see a world where Justin Jefferson is not a top five wide receiver this year. Anything can happen, but that is the range of outcomes for him. Jamar Chase, I also think the ceiling is wide receiver one overall. I think the ceiling for him is also wide receiver one overall. I think if we imagine Jamar Chase getting 170 targets this year, how high would we be drafting this guy? If he still maintains that big play upside that he has, we know what a great offense he plays in. The floor is definitely lower than Justin Jefferson and Cooper Kupp, which is why he's the third wide receiver off the board, why he's third in my rankings, and why people sometimes bypass him. I think the floor is probably like a mid wide receiver one, low end wide receiver one on the low end, but he's the deep threat. He's the number one target in an offense that could have a special season this year. Draft this man in the top five of your draft. If he slides any further than that, just pick him and thank me at the end of the season. So Davante Adams, the wide receiver four, at the time that I did this exercise, his ability makes wide receiver one still possible. He doesn't play for Green Bay anymore, which definitely hurts him a little bit because Aaron Rodgers is such a great quarterback, so elite, so efficient, and his bottom line suffers a little bit. but we still have Derek Carr, who's a good quarterback. We have an offense that should throw the ball more than the Green Bay Packers were throwing, and he can still command 30% of any team's targets, no matter who's his target competition, because he's that good. And the thing with Davante Adams actually having guys to compete for targets with Darren Waller and Hunter Renfrow, is that he won't be doubled 25% of the time like he was doubled per Matt Harmon's reception perception in Green Bay, because they knew he was the only pass catching weapon there. They, focused all their attention on Davante Adams, and maybe they're not able to do that quite as easily in Las Vegas. The floor for Davante Adams, again, top 5, top 8 wide receiver on the very low end. Stefon Diggs, wide receiver 5 when I did this exercise. If he can regain that 2020 form that we saw out of Stefon Diggs, wide receiver 1 overall is in his range of outcomes as well, because we have a top 3 offense. We have a top 3 quarterback, a team that's going to be top 3 in passing volume. And Gabriel Davis might even be able to take some attention away from Stefon Diggs, because I think that was his problem last year. I think a lot of people, a lot of defenses were really keying in on Stefon Diggs, double coverage 18% of the time, which was 5% more than 2020. The floor is also extremely high with Stefon Diggs because of the insulation that he has in the Bills offense as well. We pretty much saw his floor last year, right? It was wide receiver, 6 to 10 probably is the bear case for Stefon Diggs. So another guy that I think is very, very safe. All 5 of those wide receivers should be first round picks. No questions asked, especially in half or full PPR. If you're in a standard league, it's a little bit more up for debate. But at that point, I'm still way, way comfortable taking these guys in the first round. Now we get into the second tier of wide receivers. And honestly, I think this tier of wide receiver is anywhere from wide receiver 6 and CeeDee Lamb here all the way to like wide receiver 15 or wide receiver 13 with like Keenan Allen, Michael Pittman type of guys. But CeeDee Lamb, as you guys can see on the screen there, we've gone through the boring ones. We all knew that those high guys had top end ceilings. CeeDee Lamb, I believe, has wide receiver 1 overall in his range of outcomes. He's proven the ability to separate per Matt Harmon's reception perception. We just haven't seen the target share yet. We haven't seen the guy command a 25-30% target share. And I think they're going to remold this offense, as Danny talks about all the time, and make him the focal point for a pass-heavy offense. We expect them to be very pass-heavy in Dallas with a great quarterback like Dak Prescott. I will not be shocked if CeeDee Lamb has a similar season to, Justin Jefferson last year, and he's a top 3, top 5, maybe even the wide receiver 1 overall in fantasy. However, his floor makes him a lot riskier than those top 5 wide receivers, which is why he's a tier after those guys. There's a chance that he's a hashtag fake alpha and he's a middling wide receiver 2 this year, because he can't command an elite target share, can't command consistent targets, and he's more boom or bust on a week-to-week basis. I'm betting more on the former being the case, which is why I like CeeDee Lamb. But the median projection for him is like a top 8 finish in points per game. So I think all 3 of those scenarios exist: the median, the high end, and the low end for CeeDee Lamb, which makes him an interesting pick this year. Mike Evans, another guy that I think is a very interesting pick. At the time that I weighed these peripherals back in July with Mike Evans, it looked like Chris Godwin was going to be out for the first couple of weeks of the season, but he might actually be ready for week 1, which hurts Mike Evans' target share, but it helps his efficiency. We've seen this Buccaneers offense be much, much better when Godwin is on the field. They're like a 31, 32 points per game offense with him, and like a 26, 27 points per game without him. And especially now with Brown and with Gronkowski gone, they're really going to need tertiary targets like Chris Godwin and like the other guys, Gage and Julio Jones, to step up. But with Mike Evans, I think we're looking at a high end or mid wide receiver 1 type of ceiling, wide receiver 5, wide receiver 6, 7, or 8 as his absolute ceiling, obviously on the back of touchdowns, on the back of big plays. And his floor is probably quite high as well. I think he's a very safe pick as well. High end wide receiver 2, wide receiver 13 to 16, pretty much the baseline of what Mike Evans has been his entire career. 1,000-yard receiver, 10 plus touchdowns, I think is the absolute floor for Mike Evans, even if Godwin contributes to a high degree. So we also have Deebo Samuel, who's the next guy here. And he's really difficult for me to determine his ceiling because he's such a unique player. There's nobody in the NFL that is used like Deebo Samuel. And we also have a quarterback change in Trey Lance, which is throwing things for a loop as well. There's a world that exists where Trey Lance is some superstar quarterback, but there's also a world that exists where he's even worse than Jimmy Garoppolo was last year. And thankfully, they do have Jimmy Garoppolo now still on the roster in case Trey Lance struggles. But for me, Deebo Samuel's ceiling is probably like a mid wide receiver 1, wide receiver 5 to 8. His usage profile is unlike anything that we've really seen out of any player in the NFL in recent years. If Trey Lance is great, then I think Deebo Samuel can repeat as a top 5 wide receiver yet again. And same goes for his floor. Because he gets so many touches on the ground, through the air, I think his floor is higher than people think, because I think a lot of people are expecting regression, and rightfully so. He was very efficient last year, but the amount of times he's going to touch the ball in a game makes his floor a little bit higher, and his level of efficiency will probably determine whether he hits his ceiling or whether he hits his floor. If he has a big time regression in efficiency. His floor is probably like a wide receiver 2, wide receiver 13 to 18 type. If he gets his ceiling, he's probably more so in that top 5 to 8 range that I talked about as his ceiling. So that's Deebo Samuel. Tyreek Hill. We've seen Tyreek Hill's ceiling attached to Kansas City and the Patrick Mahomes offense. It's undoubtedly lower now in Miami because he's not getting passes from Patrick Mahomes. I still think, though, we're getting a 150 target wide receiver, a guy that has competed for targets with a guy like Travis Kelce, who I think Jaylen Waddle could probably, flirt with those type of numbers. But Tyreek Hill is the biggest matchup nightmare in the NFL. I don't think any team is going to have fun game planning for Jaylen Waddle and Tyreek Hill on a weekly basis. The ceiling for Tyreek Hill, I think, is a mid wide receiver 1. Again, wide receiver 5 to 8, and his floor should be about the same as the last couple guys that I've talked about. Mid wide receiver 2 type, wide receiver 13 to 18. So he doesn't have the same range of outcomes that he had in Kansas City, but still a very, very solid pick at the end of the second, early third round where he currently goes. T. Higgins, again, I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but the ceiling and floor argument is basically the same for him. He gets a bum rap because Jamar Chase is there, and he's the only guy that I've talked about so far that is not the number one in his offense. But we have a guy with a 150 target projection from an elite quarterback. And to me, that's enough for a mid wide receiver 1 ceiling, even if Jamar Chase outperforms him. If Jamar Chase is a top 3 wide receiver, I still think T. Higgins can be wide receiver 7, wide receiver 8, wide receiver 6 in points per game. And we could see both of these guys finish top 10 because they both finished top 12 last year as a rookie wide receiver, a second year wide receiver, in an offense that didn't throw the ball a ton, and with a quarterback who was coming off a torn ACL. All those factors are better this year than they were last year. So the bull case is that the Bengals just go nuclear and there's some special offense and these guys are great as a result. And the bear case, the low end case, is maybe that T. Higgins is just outshined by Jamar Chase. He's this dominant alpha wide receiver with 180, 190 targets. Or maybe the Bengals have a Super Bowl hangover or something like that. But for the most part, I think even at the low end, we have a mid to low end wide receiver 2 with T. Higgins. The ceiling is still quite solid as well. I think he's relatively safe this year as well. A.J. Brown, a guy that I think people have a hard time envisioning the ceiling for because this offense has been run heavy and we only really have 1 year of Jalen Hurts being a starter. And in that 1 year, it was a run heavy offense. So people have a hard time, determining if it can ever go pass heavy with a mobile quarterback. But the ceiling case for A.J. Brown is that his addition to this offense makes them more balanced and it makes them pass the ball more. And he's 130 to 160 target receiver, which, by the way, he has never seen anywhere remotely close to that volume in Tennessee. And he has top 5 upside as a result. It could be a similar situation to what we saw from Stefon Diggs once he came from the run-heavy Minnesota Vikings to the pass-heavy Buffalo Bills. In my opinion, his floor is probably in the mid to low wide receiver 2 range because maybe Jalen Hurts struggles or maybe Devontae Smith and Dallas Goedert take a lot of targets away from him. But I do think, just like I said with CeeDee Lamb, I think the first scenario is the scenario I am betting on with A.J. Brown, the scenario that I think is more likely. Keenan Allen going off the board as the wide receiver 12 or so. Admittedly, Keenan Allen is more of a floor play, which at running back, we never want to draft floor plays, but with wide receivers, I'm definitely okay doing so because wide receivers get hurt less than running backs. They bust at a lower rate than running backs. I don't see any way that Keenan Allen is not a wide receiver 1 or at least a top 15 guy at worst. I'm of the belief, too, that he might have a higher ceiling than people think because the last 2 years with Justin Herbert, he scored the most touchdowns over a 2-year stretch of his entire career. If we're talking about a wide receiver who emerges from the Cooper Kupp territory of the draft from last year to have a 1,500-yard, multi-touchdown, 10-plus touchdown season, I think Keenan Allen can do it. I think his ceiling is probably a mid wide receiver 1, maybe top 5 if Justin Herbert has some monster season. But I think wide receiver 1 is pretty much a lock. I think his floor is wide receiver 1, wide receiver 12, wide receiver 13, wide receiver 14. So I think he is a very, very safe pick in the third round of drafts. Speaking of Keenan Allen, let's go to his teammate, Mike Williams, who at the time that I did this was wide receiver 13 in ADP. If we're taking weekly ceiling into account, then Mike Williams is definitely a guy that is a high ceiling pick. But I think on the entire spectrum of the season, I don't think his ceiling is very high. I think we're talking about a boomer bust, high-end wide receiver 2 on the very nuts case for Mike Williams. And I think that's kind of like a poor man's Mike Evans type of outlook. We have a 5 or 6 year sample now of Mike Williams being in the NFL, being a certain archetype of wide receiver, which was downfield, red zone type of usage, high value targets, but not being a guy that's going to command 150, 160 targets on a season. And we have like some small sample size of seeing that, but I don't think that's necessarily what we want to go off of when we have all this other data about Mike Williams as a player. I think he's going to be the deep threat for Justin Herbert, guy that's going to be used in the red zone. and finish as a wide receiver two. But a high end wide receiver two is the absolute ceiling I see for Mike Williams. Low end wide receiver two, boomer bust type of guy is probably his floor. Michael Pittman Jr., who wide receiver 14 when this was being done in July, he has since risen from this ADP, and it makes sense why. Because aside from the Colts not being the most pass heavy offense in the league, there isn't really much wrong with Michael Pittman Jr.'s outlook. For Pittman, he could go from a second year promising wide receiver, take another step as a third year guy, and become a dominant alpha wide receiver with Matt Ryan there now as his quarterback, with all the attention on Jonathan Taylor of defenses that are playing the Indianapolis Colts. I think Michael Pittman has a top 5 to 8 wide receiver in his range of outcomes. His floor is probably, he's just inefficient on his targets for whatever reason. Maybe he's playing through injury or something, and he's about as good as he was last year. So a guy that could be, wide receiver 15 to 20, but a little bit disappointing relative to where you picked him, thinking he was going to have a breakout season. But he's also another guy that I think is a great, great pick in terms of range of outcomes this year. DJ Moore, a guy that we saw an elite ceiling from at the beginning of last season in the few games that Sam Darnold was playing like a legitimate quarterback. But Baker Mayfield, I don't think is going to be a massive upgrade, but he could be enough of an upgrade to get DJ Moore to a mid wide receiver one ceiling. I don't think he's going to make him an elite alpha wide receiver one, like potentially a Russell Wilson going there or Deshaun Watson going there might have done. But the floor, as we've seen, can be kind of low with DJ Moore. I think a lot of people label him as a safe player, but middling to low end wide receiver two, high end wide receiver three production is what he's been when his quarterback play has not been very good. And I think that's relatively a disappointing pick at the wide receiver 15 or so in ADP. So DJ Moore, a guy that I think has a bit of a wider spectrum range of outcomes, but I do think his ceiling is quite high, and it really all hinges on how Baker Mayfield plays. Marquise Brown, you guys know I've been quite excited about Hollywood Brown this season. A high target share wide receiver, goes away from the Baltimore Ravens to an offense that's going to throw the ball a lot more, paired with his college quarterback, and he doesn't have a target like Mark Andrews to compete with, at least for the first 6 games of the season until DeAndre Hopkins comes back. The ceiling that's possible, that I think is possible for Marquise Brown, is a mid to low end wide receiver one over the course of the season, but I think he can be a top 5 wide receiver for those 6 games that DeAndre Hopkins is out of the lineup. The floor is probably a little bit lower. Low end wide receiver two, high end wide receiver three. Once Hopkins comes back, especially, maybe he's just like a deep threat for the offense and he's a little bit more boomer bust. But I think we've seen enough out of Marquise Brown to this point in his career to say that he's not just a deep threat. He can command targets. He can be, used in the slot if need be. He can be used over the middle of the field. He's not just some guy that's going to run go routes the entire game. And Courtland Sutton, wide receiver 17, I think he has a pretty high ceiling. I'm not, the highest person on Courtland Sutton in the world, but I do think he has a high ceiling because the bull case for him is that, last year's poor play was as a result of him being first year off the ACL tear, which we know has not been very kind to wide receivers. When he gets back to the 2019 form that we saw from Courtland Sutton a couple of years ago, with Russell Wilson now as his quarterback instead of Drew Lock and Joe Flacco that he had thrown to him that year, I think Courtland Sutton can be a low-end wide receiver one in this scenario. I'm not going to do the lazy thing where I say he's got DK Metcalf ceiling because he's the new DK Metcalf. No, I think his bull case is low-end wide receiver one. That's probably the highest he can finish, wide receiver 9 to 12. But why I'm lower on Courtland Sutton is because I think he has a very, very low floor. I think we could be talking about a guy that is a, quote, fake alpha, right? A guy that, for example, like Kenny Golladay. We had Kenny Golladay have some great seasons in Detroit. He goes over to New York, and we realize that he's not really an alpha wide receiver. He was paid like one, but he's not really one. And I think Courtland Sutton might just not be that good. We saw Jerry Jeudy outperform him, out-target him thoroughly all of last year. And Courtland Sutton realistically only has one good season under his belt in like 5-6 years that he's been in the NFL. So I think the floor is like a boomer bust wide receiver 3, which you will be very disappointed with if you draft him. And I think the other side of that floor is that Jerry Jeudy just vastly outperforms the guy. And that's something that we have to worry about as well. And speaking of guys with target competition, Jaylen Waddle, who was wide receiver 18 when I did this, it's very easy to just sit here and say that Waddle doesn't have a high ceiling because Tyreek is there. But the truth is, this one's the hardest for me to judge because if Tyreek did not go to the Miami Dolphins, we're talking about a guy that could have had a monster ceiling, right? Wide receiver, one type of production, his rookie season on 150 targets set the NFL's all-time record for rookie catches in a season. We're talking about a guy that could have had a monster second year, a Justin Jefferson second year, a Jamar Chase type of ascension. And Jaylen Waddle gets a guy like Tyreek Hill, which completely muddies up his outlook. But this team added a superstar wide receiver to take attention away from him. I think Jaylen Waddle's ceiling is probably capped a little bit because Tyreek's there as a high-end wide receiver 2, wide receiver 13 to 16, about where he finished last year. But his floor, I also think, is pretty high as well. High-end wide receiver 3, low-end wide receiver 2 type, wide receiver 20 to 30 or so in points per game. So the uncertainty of this new offense is going to have people, shy away from Jaylen Waddle, but I do think his ability combined with Tyreek's presence makes me think that he can have a bit higher of a ceiling and floor combination than I think many people will give him credit for. So before I take up too much of you guys' time, wide receivers 19 through 24, I'm going to go through these guys rapid fire. You guys can see them on the screen right now. Wide receiver 19, Terry McLaurin. A lot of these guys have pretty similar outlooks, so that's why I'm going through them rapid fire. Terry McLaurin, probably a wide receiver 2 through and through. On the high end, he's a high end wide receiver 2. On the low end, he's a low end wide receiver 2. It really all depends on how Carson Wentz plays, on how Jahan Dotson and some of the other pieces show up in this offense. Terry McLaurin, probably not a super high ceiling guy because of the quarterback play and the offense that they're running there. Deontay Johnson, I think, has a low end wide receiver 1 ceiling. You guys know I don't have him anywhere ranked close to this. I have him way higher than this in my rankings. I think mid wide receiver 2 is his floor because of the target earning ability that we've seen out of him in his career. We're talking about a guy that can command 28.5% of a team's targets, which he did last year as a third-year wide receiver. So I think Deontay Johnson's vastly underrated in this area of the draft. Gabriel Davis, a mid wide receiver 2 ceiling, probably has a high ceiling from a big play perspective. Again, another kind of Mike Williams archetype, but the floor is even lower for Gabriel Davis than it is for Mike Williams because I'm not even sure that Gabriel Davis is that good. But if he is good, he probably could be, wide receiver 13, 14, 15 in points per game, but his floor is extremely low. Boomer bust wide receiver 3 is like the median projection, and then like low end, not fantasy relevant at all is the floor projection for Gabriel Davis. Jerry Jeudy, ceiling is a low end wide receiver 1. I believe more in him than I do in Courtland Sutton because he's a young ascending player. I've seen more target earning ability out of him recently than I've seen out of Courtland Sutton. And the floor is probably a low end wide receiver 2, high end wide receiver 3 if Courtland Sutton ends up being the alpha in that offense. Allen Robinson, ceiling is a low end wide receiver 1. This offense can produce 2 high end wide receiver 1s, in my opinion. I think they can produce Cooper Kupp as one of the best receivers in fantasy, Allen Robinson as a guy that is definitely up there in fantasy scoring 15 plus point per game type of wide receiver as well. Floor is a low end wide receiver 2. I think he'll probably be like at minimum what Robert Woods and Odell Beckham were last year when they were on this team. DK Metcalf, the final guy that we're going to talk about, ceiling is a low end wide receiver 1 because he's just that good. And he was actually quite good with Geno Smith last year. A lot of people don't know that he actually scored more with Geno Smith than he scored with Russell Wilson. Not that I think that's going to continue, but it just proves that DK Metcalf is good enough to reproduce no matter who his quarterback is. And his floor is probably like a low end wide receiver 2 that you're not excited about, and the offense is tough to watch, and it makes you annoyed that you have DK Metcalf on your team. So if you guys enjoyed that, that was a lot of information. That was a lot of mumbo jumbo about wide receivers. Let me know down below what you think of my assessments. Let me know what your team is looking like. If you guys have already drafted, I will do some grades if you guys want to grade on your team, and I'll talk about your strengths and weaknesses and all that kind of stuff. Let me know also down below, like I said, have you drafted already? I'm curious if you guys have all had your drafts and, you guys want some more in-season type of content or trade target type of stuff, because I'm not exactly sure with this new preseason format that we've had the last couple of years when people are drafting. I know my home league drafts Labor Day weekend. I'm assuming a lot of you guys draft Labor Day weekend as well, but I'm curious to know. So if you guys are interested in that, leave it down below. Check out the pin comment as well for underdogfantasy.com. Using the promo code FSE at sign up and first deposit, you'll get 100% back on whatever you put in. You can do best ball drafts on there. They're super fun. They have Pomeranians going live. They're only $3 to enter. Big prizes on there. Get you a lot of practice for your home league if you haven't drafted yet, or win your chances at a lot of prizes like in Best Ball Mania 3, where it's a $25 entry. You could win $2 million to first, $10 million in total prizes on there. If you're interested, check it out. Promo code FSE at sign up and first deposit will get you 100% back. If you put in $100, you'll get $100 to play with. That's 8 shots at $2 million to first place in Best Ball Mania 3. But with that being said, peace out, guys. We'll talk to you soon.